See so many young faces here. I love that. And I just, I'm very honored to be able to stand in front of you guys and all the things that you guys are doing. So keep up the good work, and thank you so much for allowing me to share my heart tonight. As I begin, I want you to think about these words. Faith, family, and education are the key to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And without life, nothing else is possible. I have no doubt that God never intended us to violate this fundamental truth. It is the sixth commandment, after all, that tells us that we should not take innocent life. Today we're always hearing this term, social justice. It's become like this social buzzword, right? That means I care, or some group cares, all of those things. But typically this form of social justice is a fraud in its essence. In regards to abortion, it claims that women aren't equal in society unless they have the right to kill their unborn. It never addresses the ills that fall upon a society in which many women silently suffer after they have the abortion. How can we call ourselves civilized people as we create a culture of death and rejection? We continue to replace absolute biblical truth with a hodgepodge of moral relative codes of conduct issued by everyone's own personal Jesus. We're casting aside the most basic and essential premise of civilization, the respect of life, and innocent life at that. Society depends on people all living by the same code of conduct. And in the past, it was largely people would learn that at church, but a smaller and smaller percentage of people are going to church, and some of the churches have even sold their souls to adopting the social justice movement and its postmodern moral relativity to replace God. They do this to attract those that, for whatever reason, can't live by the laws of God, but it just seeks to increase the population that has cast off the yoke of moral uprightness that God has called us to wear. True, that yoke is very uncomfortable at times, but it's necessary to keep us civilized. Man without restraint is an animal capable of many god-awful things. And it can be seen anywhere that we can, as they kick God more and more out of cultures. The socialists, nearly 150 million people were killed, slaughtered, and starved to death by godless communists, the godless Nazis, in just this last century alone. So as we slouch towards Gomorrah, as Judge Robert H. Bork described in his book, appropriately titled Slouching Towards Gomorrah, I will argue that in order to understand abortion and its effects on society, we must go back and look at those that brought it to us and their motivations for doing so. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. We all know that Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, but we need to look at what happened before 1973 to understand what makes a society turn on itself and despise itself so much that it allows its government to legalize the killing of the unborn. Directly before the decision, we had the 1960s. In the 60s, the huge baby boomer generation mixed hormones with psychedelic drugs, rock and roll, rebellion, and a healthy dose of boredom. And as Judge Bork writes, boredom is a much underrated emotion. The young, especially the very intelligent and vigorous, who have not yet found a path in life, are particularly susceptible to boredom's relentless ache. It is an emotion that is dangerous for the individual and for society because a lot of the cures are antisocial. Alcohol, narcotics, cruelty, pornography, violence, zealotry in a political cause, and many of the 60s generation shop that list. Gerald Howard wrote, "Rock and roll, a raw and powerful form of music, crystallized all the youth's dynamicism and hypersexuality on the loose. The Pied Piper's tune of the new freedoms, an apt metaphor." I've read that the historical Pied Piper led children into the forest where he massacred and dismembered them. Todd Gitlin, once a leader in SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, stressed many of the factors that shaping his generation, and adds another, the rock bottom fact that life ends. And to adolescents without religious beliefs, that realization can be devastating. Radical politics can then become a substitute for a religion, a way to seek meaning in life, and even, one can hope, a form of immorality. To lead or to be part of a movement that changes the world is perhaps to be remembered forever. And for many, modern liberalism is a religion. Judge Bork was previously famous for being denied his appointment seat on the Supreme Court for the simple reason that he was unashamedly pro-life. I know that excerpt was long, but I think we have to look at what happened in the society in the 60s to understand how society got to the point where we've killed 50 million unborn babies and we call it a choice. The baby boomer generation was quite affluent compared to their parents who lived through the Depression. With affluency comes boredom, and with boredom comes all the temptations and the consequence of those temptations that would necessitate a need for a law to decriminalize the killing of the inconvenient unborn child. It's funny, very often I run into baby boomers who find themselves curiously inquisitive as to how I could be so conservative. And I remind them that I was born into a more conservative generation. I saw firsthand the social derangement that the 60s generation unleashed on our society. The widespread family breakdown was an inevitable consequence of their generation's efforts to create a world without consequence. When your personal Jesus continues to tell you to relax about any violation of the biblical code that your parents had taught you to follow, then eventually there are no violations worth worrying about, not even killing an unborn child in the womb. That right there is a consequence of a huge generation of youngsters seeking to cure their boredom without allowing the trip to end with inconvenient occurrences that, in previous generations, might have signaled the end of youth. It's true, while many of the baby boomers did grow up, many still haven't. Some of them that haven't grown up are running our country today. The quest for a conscience-free life has led them to adopt radical politics that are based on a code of conduct that finds itself fully in disagreement with the biblical code our Creator left us with. The sad thing is, many have had abortions themselves. Personally, I've had more than one, and I can attest that having an abortion changes you. Too often it changes you in ways you don't expect, and usually in ways you don't want it to. Without God and the forgiveness that Jesus Christ gives us, these changes can be devastating. We very often see the radical feminists spewing hatred at pro-lifers as if they were speaking in tongues from the devil himself. But that is how having an abortion changes you. If you can't come to any peace within by accepting the grace of God and His forgiveness, you are stuck inside a body whose womb is the place of a horrendous act that has taken place. That baby is gone, but the death womb isn't. It's right there with you every minute of your life. Post-abortive syndrome is not a pleasant experience, and for those who haven't accepted God's forgiveness, there is a need to lash out at those who remind you of the horrible thing that happened in your womb. There is sometimes a need to give that experience you've had to others by encouraging them to do the same thing. Misery loves company. We as pro-lifers must be aware of this. We must be sympathetic to this fact. It's easy to despise those that push and encourage abortion, but it's also easy to ignore the fact that you don't know what's going on in their heads. As a person, as a chaplain, I try and keep that in mind. It's easier to reach out to those in need by reminding them that I was once someone who is like they are right now. What they hate more than anything is judgment. But really it's not trying to escape your judgment as it is they're trying to escape their own self-judgment. This is hard to explain to someone who can't figure out how to deal with the emotions they have coming out of them due to an abortion. It was supposed to be no big deal. Before they had it, they were assured it was nothing more than a blob. But afterwards, they realize there's something missing. They can't always figure out what it is, but they do realize that they were lied to. And they struggle with as they struggle with their conscience that is trying to convince them that they actually killed a baby. I fully believe that the reason we have a conscience is because the Word of God was imprinted on our souls at conception. And without one, we'd all be psychopaths. A psychopath without a functioning conscience has been fully reprogrammed. And most of us fit in the middle. We have a conscience, but we occasionally fight with it and with the rationalization of our sins. And in any case, there are many, many women walking around our country dealing with this metaphorical, bloody stake to their conscience. There are many ways to deal with it, as you can imagine, but we too often think that abortion only affects the child that dies, but it also affects the mother that let it die. She goes in thinking that she'll come out a woman without a child, but as I write in my essay in the book Life at All Cost, edited by Dr. Alveda King and Dr. Laverne Tolbert, this woman eventually realizes that she's really a mother of the dead child, and that needs to be mourned. And at least that was my realization. Those that run from this realization too often try to convince others to do the same thing that they've done. But for people like me, I want to do the exact opposite and help them avoid this fate. Furthermore, we very often neglect the effects of abortion on the father of the child. While he may not experience the same physical disconnect of losing a child, as the mother might have, there's still a post-abortive syndrome that goes along with that. Men suffer a little more quietly with their emotions. And with that in mind, we must be sensitive to this as we try to help society cure itself of this self-destructive social plague that has left over 50 million Americans without life. Now, I don't in any way want to insinuate that I believe abortion was created by the baby boomer generation. It was a bubbling poison in the American culture before it actually became illegal to make abortion illegal due to the Supreme Court's ruling. In fact, abortion and baby killing existed before America was even conceived. In 2 Kings, we read about the king of Moab offering his son to the demon god Chemosh by burning him. In Leviticus chapter 20, we read about how God denounces the demon god Moloch by name. And as Dr. Laverne Tolbert writes in Life at All Cost, God further warns that he will cut off the people of God, not only the one who practices in such sacrifice, but all of those who close their eyes to the man when he gives his child to Moloch. Leviticus 24. But we as humans too often ignore the Bible and create our own morality to suit our purpose here on earth. In the 19th century, the eugenics movement was begun by Francis Galton, who is considered the father of eugenics. He made his family fortune from the slave trade. Incidentally, he was Charles Darwin's cousin, and while Darwin's theories are taught to our children as fact by order of the government that has chased God out of all curricula, Darwin's motivation to develop part of his theory is left out of these government-mandated teachings. Darwin contended that the man evolved from apes in order to argue that the black man is inferior because he is somehow closer in genetic evolution to the ape. And for that reason, there was no reason to grant the black man equal rights in society, even though he was no longer a slave. That's right, I said it. Darwin was a racist making arguments that his slave trading cousin was using to justify his efforts to eliminate the black man from society. One must remember, during the time of slavery, the slaves were considered property. Once they were freed, they became liabilities. And for those with money and wealth, that meant their incomes would be used to take care of the freed blacks who weren't capable of functioning economically in a society that discriminated against them. Upon being freed from slavery, they didn't all of a sudden learn how to read. Frederick Douglass was taught to read by his slave master's wife against the will of his slave master, but he was an exception. Those that owned slaves kept them illiterate in order to keep them from desiring or seeking freedom. Therefore, those that had wealth had to protect that wealth. They needed to fund something that would keep the cost of civilization down by getting rid of black people. Along came Margaret Sanger, her birth control review, and the American Birth Control League, which later changed its name to Planned Parenthood to further hide its original intent. You see, Margaret Sanger didn't want to say outright, hey, we eugenicists want to kill blacks. They stated that their goal was to improve society by improving the genetics of the population without describing their methods in detail. She used euphemisms for blacks. She called them feeble-minded, the shiftless, the poor. Planned Parenthood emphasized the quality of life in these arguments for sterilization of the poor and their elimination. This was her solution for the poor, and today we hear this mantra more and more. Planned Parenthood was the front group for the American Eugenics Society, to which Sanger belonged. As well, T. Lothrop Stutter and Eugene Fisher were members. They were supporters of the Nazis. In fact, Stutter met with Hitler and Himmler, who consulted him in their efforts to eliminate what they considered the weak link in the German population. And this was all funded by big money foundations in America, including the Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundations, the natural allies of the Nazis with the American eugenics movement. Incidentally, the company that made the Nazi death camp gas, Zyklon B, was IG Farben. It later became Hoechst AG. Hoechst AG then bought Russell Uclef, the French pharmaceutical company that makes RU-486, or the chemical abortion pill. And again, there is a Rockefeller connection to IG Farben. Furthermore, it's not spoken of much, but Margaret Sanger actually called for the US government to set up camps for the illiterate, the paupers, the unemployed, and those the state labeled feeble-minded. It's probably just a little more evidence of the well-known mutual admiration the Nazis and the eugenics movement had for each other. While Sanger's efforts weren't ultimately realized, there was mass sterilizations of black women, and it continued. One of these was Elaine Riddick. She was raped, impregnated, and the government told her grandmother that if she didn't have her sterilized after the baby, that they would take her benefits away from her. She was 13 years old, and the grandmother, against her, didn't tell her daughter, but they did do it out of fear of starving, losing those benefits. The government, guided by the eugenics movements, told the grandmother that the little girl was feeble-minded because she had never done a day's work, and she was 13 years old. In the movie Ma'afa 21, it's a movie that we show often, Elaine Riddick talks about her experience. She says, "They cut me open like I was a hog. I didn't know nothing about this stuff." Incidentally, the North Carolina eugenics wing that did this to her was financed by Clarence James Campbell, an heir to the Procter & Gamble fortune. One would think that if you're selling soup, it might be a little bit more profitable for you to have more people to eat your soup, but that's just me. Too many of the wealthy elites put their money towards programs that fund the culling of the black population. Even today, consider the fact that Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Ted Turner all donate millions and millions to population control programs. But it didn't stop with Elaine Riddick. Many poor blacks were told if they didn't get the sterilization and have their children sterilized as well, they would lose their welfare. Well, then along came the birth control pill. Originally, the eugenics movement hoped that it would be used by blacks, but to their unpleasant surprise, it was embraced by whites. The blacks didn't want to reduce their population and give up what little control that they did have. They were then calls to put birth control into the water system and then have blacks and the poor come and have to petition to the government in order to have the right to get pregnant. And I'm not making this stuff up. This is what was happening in America in the 60s, that era. And I know some of you may be wondering, why am I talking about this? And I'm getting to my point. The next level of extermination of the movement is, as we all know, abortion. This is what they considered the final solution. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with that term, or at least you should be. If they weren't going to kill the blacks after we were born, they were going to get it while they were still in the womb. Did you know that before Roe v. Wade, there were 5 whites having abortions to every 1 black having an abortion? Before 1973, the black family was as intact as the white family in America. And keep that in mind, because after 1973, it all changed. Now, I just want to read you a few statistics from an article from my dear friend that I love and is truly amazing, Reverend Walter Hoy. He does the personhood movement. and he's also Frederick Douglass Foundation of California leader. In 1973, over 14.5 million black babies have been killed by abortion. That's 1,200 black babies a day. Blacks account for 13% of the population, but 30% of the total abortions since 1973. And today that number has risen to 37% of all abortions in the country that are performed on black women and their preborn children. Abortion alone accounts for 3 times more death in our community than HIV, AIDS, violent crimes, accidents, cancer, and heart disease combined. I cannot wait. My people are dying. According to the Alan Guttmeicher Institute, the research arm of the Planned Parenthood, black women are nearly 5 times as likely as non-Hispanic women to have an abortion. My people are dying. Also, according to the Guttmeicher Institute, since 1973, more black babies have been killed by abortion than the total number of black Americans killed from all other combined causes. My people are dying. These numbers are no surprise considering that 60% of all Planned Parenthoods are strategically located in black communities. Our people are dying. Today, for every 100 black babies born alive, there are another 77 black babies killed by abortion. I cannot wait. Our people are dying. According to the Tuskegee Institute, between 1882 and 1968, 3,446 Negroes were lynched by the KKK in the U.S. Today, abortion in the black community kills more black Americans in less than 3 days than the Ku Klux Klan could kill in 86 years. Did you hear that last stat? Planned Parenthood kills more blacks in 3 days than the KKK managed to do in 86 years. In New York City, for every 1,000 black babies born to teens, 1,686 are aborted. And for blacks of all ages, for every 1,000 live births, there are 1,288 aborted. In other words, people are dying. And to paraphrase Reverend Johnny Hunter and many other black pro-life leaders, the most dangerous place for a black baby is in his mother's womb. This overt racism behind the drive to cull black people in the womb didn't just disappear when Bill Clinton became president and the black liberals loved him because he plays saxophone, loves fried foods, and cheats on his wife. Nope. One of his Supreme Court appointments, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, said in 2009 in a New York Times interview, quote, "Frankly, I thought that at the time Roe was decided, there was concern about population growth, and particularly growth in the population we don't want to have too many of. Our Supreme Court Justice sober description of abortion as a tool to eliminate people from society that society doesn't want is eerie similar to Margaret Sanger's description of weeds, or to pull the weeds, meaning black people, from society." So Sanger went to the pastors in the black church and convinced them to be frontmen for the eugenics movement. Soon you'd hear them give pro-eugenics sermons. With Rockefeller money, they formed the RCAR, or the Religious Coalition of Abortion Rights. The name was changed in 1993 to the Religious Coalition of Reproductive Choice. The dean of the historical black college, Howard University's Divinity School, is the chairman of the board. If you go to their website, they've got articles demanding that FDF member and niece of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s Alveda King, which is his niece, cease calling abortion genocide. They have another article calling it a racist campaign against women of color. Think about that. If you say something like, black women shouldn't kill their babies, they call you a racist, even if you're black. How does Satan whip up logic like that with a straight face? Did you know that in the early days of abortion, before blacks were killing themselves in brown buildings with tinted glass that prevents the outside world from seeing what's going on, so-called civil rights people like Jesse Jackson were pro-life? The Nation of Islam, the Black Panthers, they were all pro-life. But then that Rockefeller money started to flow like the oil that made it, and these leaders committed treason on their own people. They sold us out. And look at the shape of the black family in America today. But it's not just here in America. The United Nations actually refuses to contribute aid to nations that are in need after a natural disaster unless they approve birth control and abortion. When doctors go to clinics to set up in these nations, the supply rooms have tons of medicine and equipment for birth control and abortion, but nothing that will help actually deliver a baby. This is what our international aid dollars are funding. It's easier to feed the needy when there are a lot fewer needy mouths to feed. Listen, I could go on and on and on regarding this, but I just wanted to give you a taste of some of the educational truths that we at Frederick Douglass Foundation use as an educational foundation in our efforts to help America realize the real history and the real motivations behind the genocidal plague that has killed 50 million people here in America in the last 40 years. 50 million people are a lot. Those are dictator numbers. Hitler killed 13 million in death camps. Lenin notched 7, 8 million. Stalin was up into the mid-40s. Mao might have gotten around 50 million kills. Who can say? The important part is, not even the worst genocidal maniac in our world's history have beaten the kill numbers of the abortion mills in America. What does society do? What are we to do about this? We have to ask ourselves, what did the titans of industry from yesteryear get for their money? Has the money Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Ted Turner used to cover the abortions of those that they don't want to feed really been worth the investment? Consider this. What does the treatment of abortion as a civil right do to the developing mind of a young man? He suddenly feels entitled to being able to coax his girlfriend into getting an abortion when she gets pregnant, because the consequence of that life change that fatherhood would entail would be too great. There's very little pressure on these boys to man up and accept their role as father. And this pressure pales in comparison to the pressure on the pregnant woman to actually get the abortion. This is the case now, even more than it was before abortion was turned into a rite of passage, especially in the minority community. Back then, the black family was intact as the white family. However, now, over 70% of black children in America are born out of wedlock. Over 70% of black children in America grow up without fathers in their home. Over 70% of all men in prison in America are black. Over 70% of those black prisoners grew up without a father. Are you seeing a pattern here? The boy today is taught early that he doesn't have to be responsible for the children he creates, especially by the fact chances are his own father wasn't even around. With teenage black unemployment over 44% right now, chances are he doesn't have a father keeping him straight, he doesn't have a job to keep his hands busy, he doesn't have a child who expects him home at night, he doesn't have a girlfriend or a wife who expects him to be there, and he's well aware of how to talk a girl into having an abortion if he slips one past the goalie. His hands are idle, and idle hands do the devil's work, and the prisons are filled with boys just like this one. It's very easy to live up to the expectations when the expectations are so low. And this is how too many blacks in America suffer from the soft bigotry of low expectations. And what does this teach him about life? When society teaches him that it's all right to take the life of an unborn child, what kind of lesson is that? This is the same society that's run by a government that gives his mother and many of mothers that he knows benefits. He's not so dumb as to conclude that the child was guilty and deserved to die. However, in a world full of angst, hormones, and drugs and alcohol to help soothe the boredom that Judge Robert Bork wrote of, he might find it a little bit easier to kill someone who isn't so innocent as an unborn baby, who has never sinned as an unborn baby has. Pop, 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 there goes another one of our boys. And it might be over a nice pair of sneakers. That's where this ideology of being pro-death leads us. A society filled with bored and unemployed boys with idle hands and a reprogrammed sense of morality. And I could mention the lack of education, but ultimately, the mass lack of interest in getting an education is a result of a society that has such low expectations to begin with. Why bother learning to read when the government will clean up all of your messes anyway? We are all imprinted with the biblical knowledge of right and wrong. And I can't prove that, but that is what faith is for. The welfare state, built around the ceremony of abortion, seeks to reprogram that knowledge. It's in very unbiblical ways. Think about a single mother who has so many kids that she doesn't have time to work. It's a simple fact that many of the fathers of those children don't step up because they're convinced that if she didn't have the abortion, that child is no longer his problem, but her problem. Then she takes the responsibility to care for the children, and too often doesn't have the money to afford the family that she has. And in other words, she needs benefits. And those government checks are the most solid source of income that she's ever had. But if she meets a nice man, wants to get married, ultimately, she has to choose between a sure thing in the form of a government check and a man who may not always have a job and can't take care of her the way that check could. In other words, the system that has ensnared people is not a safety net, it's a spider web. It might keep her from falling, but it also works to keep her from getting up. It's a system that takes away her benefits if she does something right, like getting married. It's a system that pays her more if she has another child out of wedlock. The system rewards wrong behavior and punishes right behavior. And those definitions of right and wrong are right there in our Bible. And that's why this welfare state is so unbiblical. It rots from the top to the bottom. And abortion is the holy communion of ceremonial rites inside this rotten system. Sacrifice your baby on the altar of Planned Parenthood, and we'll give you everything you need to do it. And I don't care what color you are, how wealthy you are, how religious you are. This affects us all. Society will cave in upon itself without the foundation of marriage and family holding it up. The abortion numbers for the black community are extremely high, but the numbers for whites are high too, and Hispanics are getting right up there as well. The Hispanic family, as it becomes more and more Americanized, is becoming more and more disjointed, just like the black family has done before it. As a spider web of the welfare state sucks them in, it will just get worse. And as part of this misguided form of social justice, we have white women leading the charge, dressing up in vagina outfits on the Washington's lawn, demanding free on-demand abortions. However, should we just resign ourselves to the social black hole that will ultimately swallow everything that's good in America, or should we fight like the future of the world depends on us? For me, it's the latter. I've had 2 abortions. I no longer seek to justify and rationalize it. I was lied to by many, but it was my seeking of forgiveness that has brought me to the place where I can stand here before all of you fine people. And that's the message we must carry. It's not one of judgment, it's one of salvation. Salvation is there for anyone who seeks it. But how do you convince, the ultimate question, right? Your atheist friends who have no faith in anything other than the world needs to shed some mouths to feed and that abortion is an effective way to do it? Well, you need to know their weakness. They don't like normally being thought of as a racist. So enlighten them to some of the statistics I listed off earlier. And remind them that Planned Parenthood kills more blacks in 3 normal days in America than the KKK killed in 86 years. Then you say, if you support that, you're not only a racist, but you're a generational genocidal racist. Then they'll say that we can't afford to feed all those children, and blah, blah, blah. So you follow up with one last thought. So you agree with the KKK that those black babies should be killed, and leave it at that. You won't convince them, but you'll have planted a seed. Chances are that fact alone might help them rethink their social programming. Look, you're not going to fix the soul of America in 3 days. But if we don't look for new ways to attack this plague, we'll never be able to fix it. It was once said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is. Well, today, I want to leave you with this. Using the whole idea of social justice. If abortion, the killing of an innocent, helpless, and voiceless child, is not wrong, then nothing is. It is up to you in this room to pick up the mantle and fight. The country needs you to fight for what is right, and fight for what is right in the biblical sense, not as determined by man, corrupted by the pleasures of flesh, seeking a life that is free of consequence. Life is precious, and anyone who rationalizes the extinguishing of the life of an unborn child should realize they're doing so with the arguments of Satan. There's nothing biblical that justifies the killing of an innocent child. Thank you.